A very warm welcome to Ellen Harvey. Thank you for agreeing to doing this talk in times of Zoom. This is really awesome that we have this opportunity and also the possibility to welcome so many people, so many guests to our conversation, which would normally probably not be possible due to travel restrictions or some other reasons. So a warm welcome to all of you. Ellen and I have started to work on this exhibition actually already a couple of years ago, and I'm very happy that it was possible to realize this exhibition at the Museum der Moderne, which is actually the first solo exhibition in a museum for Ellen. And in Austria, yes. And we called this conversation today Love and Disappointment, because we thought that love and disappointment are very core themes and topics, not only in her works, but also these days, especially. When I'm thinking of love, I'm thinking a lot about one quote that I read in an interview with you, Ellen, where you pointed out your great love for painting. So it would be awesome if you could start off by telling us how this love for painting evolved and how this fascination for the medium developed.
I think I've always loved painting since I was a very small child. I think, like many people, I was just fascinated by the sort of beauty and simplicity of making a mark on a piece of paper or sometimes a wall. And I think maybe it's also because I didn't grow up in a sort of multimedia world in a way. Painting was something that was a huge spectacle for me. I thought that, you know, enormous history paintings, which is what I loved as a child, especially if they had lots of naked people who I didn't normally get to see, were one of my great sort of pleasures. They just were such sort of spectacular and extraordinary things to get to see. When I was 6, in fact, I asked my mother if we could go to see paintings, and my mother, we were living in Frankfurt at the time. My mother rather enterprisingly took us to Florence, and we spent a whole week looking at nothing but paintings and eating pizza on the street, which is one of my happiest childhood memories. And I still remember very vividly the Uffizi, especially because I bought the catalogue of the Uffizi at that time, which I kept, I still have. And this is the cover image on it, which is this crazy painting by Johann Zoffany of the Tribune of the Uffizi, of the sort of central area of the Uffizi. And it's actually fascinating because it's filled with all these rich white Englishmen who are all on the grand tour. I like that the Venus is being particularly admired in front. And I think it tells you a lot about painting, both this way in which painting is something that is very humble, in the sense that everyone can paint or draw. Like you don't need a lot of like sort of fancy infrastructure to make a painting. But at the same time, painting also is something that's always been a status symbol. And nowadays, when it doesn't fulfill any of the functions that it used to fulfill, it's also kind of an art signifier. So it lives in this really interesting place where socially, if you see a painting, you're like, well, that's an artwork, because what else could it be? It doesn't do any of the things it used to do. You know, you wouldn't, like, we don't paint miniatures of our loved ones anymore. In some ways, it's almost like I mean, the closest thing that's technologically to it maybe is a Polaroid, where nowadays, you know, Polaroid's charm is entirely nostalgic. And this question of art and nostalgia and art and tourism and art and social status, I mean, these are all things that have, you know, that I've circled around, like, I know, I suppose water going down a drain for most of my 20 years as an artist. In fact, there was a point when I got very, very down on painting, and I decided it was really only functioning as kind of wallpaper for the rich. And I just thought, why should I be a painter in this day and age? You know, why should I make things? These are all paintings of wallpaper, hung over wallpaper, which were intended to be exhibited at art fairs. But then at the same time, there's a more hopeful side of being a painter, which is that, like many things that can seem inherently reactionary, they can also be revolutionary. You know, the simplicity of painting as a medium means that it is also very accessible. And that question of then who of the people who use this very simple medium is allowed to be an artist is sort of what kind of inspired a whole series of works of mine, starting with the New York Beautification Project. I became very interested in this question of, the Sunday painter. Is the Sunday painter an artist? Is it all about the gatekeeper? Is the graffiti artist an artist? When I was working on this project at the end of, 20 years ago, the end of the last century, there was a huge crackdown on graffiti art in New York City. And a lot of it was all sort of talking about how transgressive it was, it was unattractive. And I thought, well, what happens if you change the demographic of the person doing it? So I'm no longer not a young man. And one couldn't help but notice that young men of color were being particularly targeted by the police. But I'm a white woman in my 30s. And then I thought, what if I, instead of using spray paint, I use oil paints? I wanted to interrogate this question of what changes if you change the aesthetics and the demographics. So this first one was done in Highbridge Park, in this place where they found a kind of armless, legless torso when they renovated it. It was a place where sort of stolen cars went to die, and they had asked some artists to make some art projects to sort of increase participation in the park. Of course, only the artists and the artists' friends came. But I made this piece thinking, there's all this graffiti, I could do graffiti too. And I thought, what would be some aspirational graffiti for this park? And so this is based on a Claude Lorrain. It's not a very good painting. And at this point, I wasn't interested in landscapes at all. I'd never liked landscapes. I'd always thought they were boring. So I picked them because they were the most sort of anodyne image that I could imagine. I thought, nobody can be offended by a landscape. But at the same time, I'm still breaking the law. So if we keep on going to the next slide. Once it was done, I had a lot of experiences on the street. So, I got beaten up by the police once when they mistook me for a homeless person. I met a lot of graffiti artists. But then I thought the project really needed a map, because of course, a map is something that all good public art projects have. And this, and at the same time, it also became a book, because the stories of what happened really were incredibly inspirational to me. When I exhibit it now, it's exhibited along with a diary of what happened at each of these places, and of course what happened in the larger context of the art world. I thought it's always interesting how a thing gets disseminated. Like, what makes a thing art? What makes a thing graffiti? Who's allowed to be an artist? Who gets to speak? Who gets to be, who gets arrested? These are questions of social consensus in a way. And that's something that I've always found particularly fascinating. When you can imagine a world where there aren't any artists, where the stuff that we do that we call art is called something totally different. But of course, that's not the world we live in.
So the interesting aspect about your work, especially in this case, is also that it's making people aware of how we consummate art, and that there's a difference which kind of art forms, as you already mentioned with the graffiti, also make it into art history. Only recently there have been books and a more awareness that graffiti really is a work of art, on different kinds of art are introduced or included in this universe of what is considered art. So this is very great that you made this very important step also to make people aware of this. And so what you also do is you use art as a mirror of society, sort of, which I like very much. When did you actually start including the public in the works? Because this already hinted on your interest in working with the public. You were very open during these days when you were working on these sites. A lot of your diary entries also talk about your conversations with people. How did it happen that you started really working with the public?
Well, I think that along with the question of who gets to be an artist is the question that every artist has to ask themselves, which is, am I an artist? And you're an artist if other people think you're an artist. And then there's sort of the inevitable next question is, if I'm an artist, what should I be doing? What should an artist do? What's an artist for? If you think about it, most people have jobs where somebody else tells them what they need done. And as an artist, nobody tells you. So it's really great when you interact with the public, because people have lots of opinions. And one of the most common things that people said to me, apart from, oh, you should paint my house, or you should beautify this place or this place. And that's, of course, why that project was called the Beautification Project, was that this idea of art as a tool of beautification is something that, was kind of making fun of a little bit, because it's obviously, they're ludicrous and tiny. But a lot of people also said, oh, well, you should paint my daughter. So I thought, well, as a kid, I used to always see all those people sitting outside the museum making free portraits, and I would get my portrait drawn, and I would think, I met an artist. I would be so excited. And of course, there comes a point when you realize that for a lot of people, those are not artists. And of course, for many of us, they are artists.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, I too could do that. So I started doing free portraits on the street. So I started really doing a lot of the things that people had suggested to me. So I did free portraits on the street, and people just had to fill out forms saying what they thought of them. On the street, people tended to be quite critical. My portrait looks good. I wonder if I could get a left eyebrow. And then I gave away all the portraits. This was a gift project. Interestingly enough, I then did it later inside the Whitney Museum as part of the Whitney Biennial, and we exhibited then all of the questionnaires. People had to evaluate their portraits, because of course, I used to always think this, when you see a portrait, you always wonder if the person who was painted was satisfied with it, whether they thought it was a good likeness. And it was remarkable to me. Outside on the street, I would say that people had nothing but criticisms. Once I was inside the museum, and I hadn't got any better. I hadn't been practicing in the years in between. Suddenly, all of them were writing about what a remarkable job I'd done, what an honor it was to meet me. Suddenly, all of them were writing about me, as opposed to themselves. It's quite fascinating how just the change of context can change the reception of an identical project. So I've always been interested in this back and forth between people, the audience, and the artist. I've always liked this sort of cliche, that old canard of art holding a mirror up to nature. And then there's that question of, like, if I'm a mirror, what kind of mirror am I? Am I any good as a mirror? Well, sometimes I seem to be good, and sometimes I seem to be bad. I often think of art as a sort of failed mirror. It's a fragmented attempt to show us the world. And we all experience art, and we all experience everything through the lens of our own experiences. So when we see an artwork, we tend to see it through our own preconceptions. That's what we bring to it. And when you put an actual physical mirror in an artwork, then of course people see themselves. So you have to kind of blot out yourself in order to see the artwork. But at the same time, it makes, I think, people conscious of the fact that you are in the work, that the work is really for you and about you. I really think of art as a conversation. It doesn't make any sense if I'm just talking without anyone talking back. Something like The Disappointed Tourist, which we'll talk about later, is really dependent on people interacting with it. And it gets all of its content from suggestions from the public.
Right, that's why I also added this image of our own exhibition at the museum, which you can see until Sunday. So just take advantage of the last days if you're here. And it was a wonderful treat also to the public that you actually have been working in the exhibition in the museum yourself, and thus offered the audience also a possibility to talk to you about the Disappointed Disappointed Tourist project. And people also had the opportunity, so the iPads on the table, as you can see now with these two guests, to log into the website, to look into the sites that have already been painted for this project that we will talk about in detail later, and also to submit work. So you have this double possibility of interacting with the artwork, becoming part of the artwork, but also talking to you. You told me that it was also very special for you as an artist to really live and experience the exhibition that way. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience?
I think as an artist, you make a lot of objects that in a sense are pre-verbal, or maybe they're slightly verbal, but they're quite confused and incoherent. You make experiences for people and you hope that there'll be rich experiences, that there'll be experiences that will seduce people into thinking or into being open to a new thought. And so it's really interesting to sort of sit quietly in the corner of a project and watch how people interact with it. I think it's something probably all artists should do, though it does feel a tiny bit embarrassing. But I have to say that in general, I was very touched by the amount of time and attention people gave the work, and the questions that they had tended to be, incredibly thoughtful. I think that obviously an artwork that's in a museum, you have a pre-selected audience. You have people who are coming to interact with an artwork. But at the same time, they could just walk in and walk out and go home and watch television. So I think I always feel tremendously grateful when anyone wants to spend time with something that I've made for them.
When speaking of the mirror, sorry, here's another installation view of the exhibition. Very often, artists also use mirrors also for self-portraits. So the mirror is also a kind of way for an introspection and for reviewing the role as an artist and how you present yourself. This is just one aspect that's also included in the exhibition. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is like depicting yourself in invisible self-portraits, as you called them?
Well, I think that, like you said, the self-portrait traditionally tends to be kind of an advertisement for the artist as an artist, as a special person. And yet at the same time, I've always felt very uncomfortable with this artistic persona of the artist as a genius or someone who's somehow different from other people. I think, an artist is just an artist. An artist is a person, just like everyone else. And I mean, I do kind of go with the idea that everyone is an artist. I'm with Boyce on that. But I think that when you do try to show yourself, for me, it's inevitably a failure. So I like to sort of pre-embrace failure in a lot of my work. So these are all failed self-portraits where you just see the flash rather than the artist. They're all based on photographs taken in mirrors. In some cases, they pretend to be Polaroids. In other cases, they pretend to be mirrors themselves. And I'm interested in this idea that you think you're going to get one thing and then you get something else. You think you're going to see the artist, but instead you just see that sort of reflective surface. But at the same time, it is a painting, it's not a photograph. And of course, nowadays, all of these paintings, which were done quite a while ago, have a very different meaning because they really call out to this world of the selfie, this world where we're constantly sending out images of ourselves in a way that in 2009 wasn't quite such a phenomenon.
There is also a part of this series that's actually called My Own Collection Inadequately Documented. So the collection as a point of interest also then points to, I'm just scrolling through these images that show mirrors and self-portraits, to the museum with the collection. And you've been working with museums and in museums for a very long time, or quite often. You started off by talking about the Zofanie painting in your Uffizi, and of course the presentation of works and collections have changed very much since the late 18th century. And I remember my first encounter with your work was actually this exhibition that we're showing right now in the slide, is a Whitney for the Whitney at Philip Morris in 2003. So what is your interest in collections and how these collections are presented, or what are the questions that you'd like to discuss when you look into how collections are organized, for example?
Well, another way in which people become artists is not just by other people deciding that they're artists, but also by museums and other gatekeepers deciding that you're an artist. That's a large part of how art is produced socially, so to speak. And this is a project that was made for the Whitney Museum in New York. Used to have this sort of little exhibition space in the headquarters of the Philip Morris building, you know, the cigarette makers. And they had had it for about 25 years, and it was the anniversary. And they invited me to do a project, and I thought, well, I bet Philip Morris is disappointed. It's been 25 years, they've been supporting the museum all this time, and who do they get? They get some totally unknown artist, you know, to show with them. So I thought they should be rewarded. So I made, you know, and also I'd seen people come to this this little space and sort of say, oh, this is the Whitney. It's very small. I thought it was uptown. So there was a way in which it already was sort of this confusing space. So I thought, well, I'll make a Whitney for the Whitney of Philip Morris. So I made a big gold frame. So it would be a painting, but then it's a walk-in painting. And it's a painting of all the paintings that, well, all the images that were included in the Whitney's catalog that it had just put out called American Visionaries. And so you can see the catalog, which is kind of like torn apart and reassembled in the middle. And I just sort of done these sort of punk copies of all of them. And the sort of subtitle of it was, you know, I can be an American visionary too, which, given that I wasn't a US citizen at the time, seemed somehow very important to me. But I like this idea of, you know, the museum has always spoken to me because I think it's almost impossible for any of us to be one person. It's also impossible for any of us to be one artist. None of us are unitary, you know, we're different in different contexts. And I think that, you know, the same way that I wake up one morning thinking one thing, the next morning I might wake up thinking something completely different. So I love the idea of museums as being a place where there are lots and lots of different voices, and where you don't have this sort of idea of just one artist speaking, but you have all these different objects kind of arguing with each other. So I like the idea of making something like that.
Yeah, that's really a very good idea and a nice way to put it. It's something that also we did at the museum in 2019 with the project The Tip of the Iceberg, where all of the curators and the director of the museum selected works from our collection, because obviously you can only always see the tip of the iceberg. Also, like this presentation of the Whitney is only like the masterpieces and not, of course, the entire work. And we discussed a lot how we choose works and why we choose them, and which topics or artists should be more articulate or not. And it was a very, very interesting project with many voices parallel. So I think this is a really great opportunity to look into collections. But then there's always also, or there you see a detail of this work, this moment of failure, sort of, where you break the rules, where things might not work, and failure, and also the how you say that, advantages of failure are very present in your work as well. The breaks, the things that maybe you point into to get new ideas, things that just don't work just like that. And it's interesting that also you have an installation actually called the Museum of Failure. So this is what we see right now. It's a mirrored wall with blank frames. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
This is probably the most depressing artwork that I ever made. This paradoxically was in some ways a very successful artwork, because it was included in the Whitney Biennial in 2008. But it was really a moment of complete despair for me. It was a moment when I felt really haunted by all of the issues that I wanted to deal with as an artist. I'm quite a politically engaged person. I care deeply about climate. I care deeply about the sort of well-being of our world. And I feel that a lot of the time, obviously, what I'm doing it seems completely irrelevant. And so the front part of this, the image that we see is a wall of mirrors, and it's engraved with a salon style hanging of an empty exhibition where there's no subject matter, where the context of the art world or the institution has completely eaten up all the subject matter. And then there's a little hole. One of the openings is actually open, and through it you can see some color. And so you think, oh, that's going to be the subject. There's going to be something exciting, so then you go behind it and you see something that is, this is looking through the hole, you see something that's actually based on, in terms of color, very much on that original Uffizi visit with my mother. And it's a huge painting. It's a trompe-l'oeil painting. It's exactly the same size and the same collection of frames, very ornate, crazy frames with this sort of, Uffizi tribune red again behind it. And inside the frames, you see details of what look like painted trompe-l'oeil mirrors, and they show my space, my studio, this sort of fetishistic place where the artist is working. You see me in sort of like a big sort of Klimt-like smock, though it's actually my pregnancy nightgown that I wore for it. But of course, you can't see me again. It's another invisible self-portrait. And I like this idea that you think there's going to be something happening, but in fact, all you see is the artist in their studio. It's like a sort of crashing disappointment. And all this effort has been spent to show you this incredibly sort of, in some ways, quite boring scene of the artist working away to make the thing that you're looking at.
Which I think is quite interesting, because for me this work is not boring at all, because you can actually see the work. If you look into the mirrors back there where I'm just pointing with the arrow, you can see the painting in the painting. You see how it was made, and it's this rare opportunity of really looking into the artist's studio that is a big treat, actually.
Which of course, yeah. Whereas if you're the artist, you're like, this is just every day. So it's,
right.
Whereas I'm like, I want to do something extraordinary. I think this is where art kind of touches people's hearts, is that we've all had that experience of wanting to do something extraordinary, wanting to make our mark, aiming for the stars, and yet, of course, almost everything that we do doesn't work out. I mean, or if it works out, it's a pale shadow of what we had hoped for. So I think that's something that's sort of common to the human condition, and that's, I think, why art in some ways speaks to people, is because it has this sort of overweening ambition, and then of course it very seldom delivers. But the fact that it fails is the thing that I think makes us love it.
Absolutely.
Something that's perfect.
And speaking of love, I now skip to the next slide. Of a painting by George Jones, who was actually a dear friend of JMW Turner, or in German, William Turner. And we're just reducing it to one name. I don't know why, to be honest. Turner has been a very important painter and person for you. We talked about the impact also of Turner making himself like the inventor of Impressionism, and building his own gallery space in London where he would show only his paintings, and it was not allowed for people to actually really paint this gallery only after his death, which we see here in this work. And this inspired a very important installation that you made as a commission for the newly built Turner Contemporary Museum in Margate in 2011. So this is also an installation that includes mirrors, as we saw now, with the Museum of Failure, but in a way making a collection of something that is unexpected. Can you tell us a little bit how this commission came into being, and how people also reacted when they saw this special installation that was made specifically for the opening of Turner Contemporary in Margate?
Well, I don't know if people know, but Margate is it's a seaside resort in the UK that became sort of famous around Turner's time. Turner loved it. He lived there in sin with his landlady. Had a beautiful view, beautiful woman, was this kind of one-stop shopper. And he's one of the people who popularized Margate as a particularly lovely place. It kind of was very down at heels. And once British people realized that they could fly somewhere warm to go swimming, a lot of seaside resorts in the UK kind of fell on very hard times. And when the Turner Contemporary was being built fetishistically on the site of where Turner lived with his landlady, there was a lot. I went to the town, and there was a lot of anxiety because it was quite a poor place. It still is in many ways. And there was a lot of sort of anxiety that people were going to come to the town to see the new gallery, see the new museum, and then just get back on the train and leave again. They wouldn't stay in the town. And more importantly, that they wouldn't spend money in the town. And that turned out not to be the case. But I thought it would be interesting for the opening of the museum to the new Turner Gallery, so to speak, to show the old Turner Gallery, because Turner was incredibly ambitious. He was somebody who really wanted, he wanted to be the most famous artist ever. You'd be so pleased to hear about the Turner Prize now. And he had this from age, I think, 28 on, rather unusually, had a museum of his own work. And so I recreated the dimensions of this gallery. This is in 3/4 scale, otherwise it would be truly enormous. And then because we have these paintings by George Jones of the gallery after Turner died, I recreated the arrangement of paintings, the salon style hanging, but instead of there being paintings that are all of sort of Turner's masterpieces, which he all left to the state, which are now at the Tate, I made it into a panorama of Margate as it was today. And I'm not crazy. I'm not going to go mano a mano with Turner as a painter. So I thought I would reference his engravings. So all of these are plexiglass mirrors, laboriously hand engraved by me with a tiny diamond point pencil over about a year. And it's a panorama of Margate seen from standing on the beach. I basically turned in a circle, took photographs, and then inserted them into Turner's arrangement of paintings. And when you're in it, it's called Arcade Arcadia, because on the one hand, Turner saw Margate as a kind of Arcadian site, but it's also the kind of place where you find tons of amusement arcades. So it's this idea that it's also like a hall of mirrors in an amusement arcade, that sort of old-fashioned things. These are all plexiglass mirrors, so they're a little wonky. You see yourself, and you see the Margate of today inserted into the aesthetics of Turner's time. So it's made sort of beautiful again by being old. And here's the new museum. You can see these are all details of the mirrors that are engraved. And you only see the engravings because there's light behind it. So the light comes through to make a drawing in light on the surface of the glass. It's quite beautiful.
Since the question just came up in the chat, someone was asking if you're working with a team or how you are actually, how your working process is. So maybe this is a good point to talk about that, since you said you're engraving all of them by yourself.
Yes, so everything that you see that is handmade in the exhibition, for example, or in general with me, is made by me. So I engraved all of these by hand. I did have help, so I tend to hire assistants for very large projects. In this case, I hired some young artists to help me with the underdrawings. So we projected the photographs, and they did a first drawing, which I then corrected and then did the engraving on top of. So, or with a very large painting, with the Mermaid, you'll see that I had help, tracing, doing all the under tracing. But what you actually see in each one is the painting is done by me. I don't feel, I'm kind of, I like making things. So that I don't like to give away that part. And also in some ways, this is my voice. This is so. I have nothing against other people working in different ways, but I personally like to make the work myself. I like to get help where, with building things, stretching canvases, all the other stuff, of course, when I can.
Having seen the scale of this work, can you tell us how long it took you from the time that you decided how you wanted this installation to be or what it should be until it was finalized?
It took about a year. It took me about a year to build to make the whole thing. And yeah, it was a lot of engraving. I would sit in the evenings with my hand in a bucket full of ice, because it's quite hard on your hands. Every time I do one of these engraving pieces, I swear I'll never do another one. And after a couple of years have gone by, I relent.
Can you tell us a little bit how this engraving works? Because there are mirrors, and mirrors are covered on the back side with silver or something.
Yeah, a mirror is just, if you think about it, a piece of glass, right? And then behind it is some silver. And so the light comes through and then it bounces back to you. And that's how you see yourself in a mirror. If you scratch off the silver at the back, then it's transparent glass. And then if you put a thin LED light screen, as we did in this case, behind it, then you'll see the mirror, you'll see yourself, but you'll also see the engraving as a kind of drawing in light on the surface. And it was great having people in the town come to see the opening of this, because everyone who lived in Margate immediately recognized all the landmarks. So you had people who were saying, oh, that's my fish and chip shop. You know, people love seeing their own lives in art. And it was really fun to sort of conflate these two things, this, you know, this sort of Turner worship, and especially to use Turner worship and sort of the everyday, but also to use the kind of, you know, Turner's own works. Only the very wealthy would have had the paintings. He disseminated his work a lot through engravings. So the engravings were in some ways the more popular kind of version of Turner. So it was fun to kind of do a shout out to that.
And what is also a good aspect of the work is that it showed Margate at a certain time in its history, where people were also a little bit desperate, probably, that the Turner Contemporary would only attract people coming from London, just spending time at the museum, but not leaving the footprints on the city. But fortunately, it turned out that this was not the case. So the city is thriving again a little bit more. And now with Tracy Enham's new center that's going to be built for artists in residence, this is also a very good opportunity to change the social and cultural life in the city. So I think this is a really important impact also that you made here for people to be aware of this situation.
Well, I think it also made me think a lot about this question of art and tourism, like why we go to particular places. And there are sort of narratives of particular places. Like you could see Margate as this sort of place full of like failed amusement arcades, or you could see it as an Arcadian site full of promise and magic. And I think I like works that have, you know, that conflate more than one narrative. So you have many stories that go together. I like, you know, the world is full of people trying to make simple stories, but I like the world is messy. Life is messy and irregular. And I like the idea of taking all that incoherence and showing it and saying, well, it can be beautiful, it can be ugly, it can be, you know, we can go to a beautiful place, we can make it ugly. You know, there's never just one story.
Which also leads me to the next installation and very interesting work, which is called The Unloved. And it really is about, on the one hand, how people have seen the city of Bruges in this way, so Brügge in German, and how the city evolved during the history. It is a project that you made for the Groninger Museum in Bruges. And as you can see, it also includes mirrors and views into the museum's collection about the city history. How come you called this work The Unloved?
It was not a popular title because, as people pointed out to me in Brugge all the time, they said, Bruges is very loved. It's a huge tourist attraction. And I thought, this is true, but there's a side of Bruges which is the unloved side. And I wanted to show that. So people go to Bruges. I know if you've ever gone or if you've seen that film in Bruges, they go because of the beautifully preserved medieval city. And the medieval city is preserved that way really because of a tragedy, which is that this trading city, which was incredibly wealthy, lost its access to the sea in the 15th century and then literally became the definition of a backwater. But Bruges has always owned the rights to access to the sea. And since about 100 years, it has a new canal linking the city to the sea, a completely useless and decorative canal. But at the end of it is actually one of the biggest container ports in Europe. So this is a side of Bruges, which is called Seebrugge, which is a side of Bruges that people tend not to visit. So I thought it would be interesting to show, on the one hand, to make a painting which is based on this sort of Google Earth map, this technological sublime view from above of the city, attaching to the enormous new harbor. You can see the harbor right at the end here. Everything that's water is inlaid with mirrors in this painting. The harbor at the end is actually bigger than the city. So obviously the idea that this trading city somehow needed to be linked to this, you're not going to put the containers in the medieval warehouses, right? It doesn't make any sense. So I wanted to show that, this sort of scale. And then the other side, you could see, look into the museum's archive, not their archive, into their depot, and you could see all of the old paintings of Bruges. So I hung these mirrors with holes in them, and you could look through, and behind them I'd curated a collection of more traditional picturesque views. So here you can see the mirror, and this is, if you took the mirror away, that's what you would see behind it. You'd be looking into the storage area with all these traditional picturesque views of the city, where you're looking at them, horizontally rather than vertically.
And then you also arranged them not in a chronological order, but in the order as they would depict in the landscape that you were painting, right?
Yes, it was an enfilade of 5 rooms, and as you walked through it, on one side you followed the new canal to the new port, and then the other side you followed the old canal to the old silted up port. And so at the end you would have paintings of the old port versus the new port. So you could see these sort of two histories at the same time. And of course, one of them on the right are the sort of beloved ones. But of course, they're not the really beloved paintings because they're still in storage, but they're more loved than, should we say, the Google Earth Maps version.
Okay. So this is actually also one aspect of collections in museums, in this case, a historical collection of landscapes or cityscapes and vistas. But another form of collection that a lot of museums, especially older ones, have is something you assembled here, the Nudist Museum. So you made your own museum of depictions of nude.
Well, I have to admit that as a child, I particularly loved going to museums to see naked people. You didn't get to see very many naked people in everyday life. So museums were, as far as I was concerned, were where it was at. And this is a project that I actually made for the Bass Museum in Miami Beach, where there's a lot of they're almost naked people parading about. And these are paintings that I made. There are 54 copies painted of all of they have a tiny little historical collection, and I copied every single one that had a naked person in it. And everything that's not nudity is painted in grisé, is in black and white. And then the sort of paintings are in these thrift store frames, and they're painted over, so you can kind of tell that they're not real old paintings. And then they're hung over a wallpaper of contemporary nudity, of nudes from fitness magazines or fashion magazines or pornography. And there's this sort of contrast between this sort of multifaceted, weird, antique nudity with lots and lots of tiny naked baby Jesuses and religious images, and then this kind of contemporary body, which tends to look all very, very similar, which is kind of fascinating. But this was really a shout out to my younger self, because I thought landscapes were incredibly boring, especially Turner, of course. I really disliked Turner as a child. He was always being crammed down our throat at school as such a genius. And I always thought it was just because the English wanted to claim that he had invented Impressionism. But of course, every museum has to have a gift shop. Often you think the gift shop is larger than the museum practically. So in this case, it had an enormous gift shop as well, this is the mugs department. Where these are all paintings made of things found by searching in eBay for the word nude and getting rid of everything that was an artwork and then making paintings of those. And of course, this is actually one of the great nude museums in real life. This is a piece that I made for the Barnes Foundation, which we'll just talk about very briefly. But Barnes was this crazy collector in Philadelphia, and he collected he has an incredible collection of modernist paintings and impressionist paintings, and a lot of them are these Renoir nudes. But he also collected metalwork, and he wrote about his collection. When he died, he made the museum promise never to move anything. So I decided that it would be nice to have the metalwork be a painting. I've always been interested in this question of, well, why are the fine arts more important or seen as being more important than the applied arts? So I wanted to do a sort of I don't know, make all those invisible artisans into artists, into painters. So I made portraits of all of the metalwork, and they're actually hung on magnets, you can see in the next image. So you can move them around. But of course, in the bonds, you're not allowed to move anything. So that didn't quite work out as I'd hoped. I always like to break people's expectations.
Oops, sorry. Well, actually, that's also been a question that we had been asked in the presentation of the disappointed tourist in our exhibition, if you were allowed to rearrange the works. But maybe we can go back to that when we arrive at the disappointed tourist again later on.
The answer is yes. The answer is yes. It can be arranged as many ways as people want.
And this also leads me to the question of materiality in your work, because obviously you are a painter. Painting is always a starting point or a very integral, important part in each works, but you're also very much interested in translating paintings into other materials, like you already told us about engraving. How here you have these small paintings that theoretically could be rearranged and everybody could include their own collection sequence, so to speak. And then you have works that include mirrors on wallpapers, for example, and use or actually ask questions about what is an image, how do images work, how do people approach images, and artworks in particular, specific kinds of images. So this is something that I think is very interesting. And this is also where the landscape comes in, not as a landscape painting per se, but also as a medium to start discussing how we observe and how we depict the world around us and ourselves, of course.
Well, this is I mean, just the same way that in the barns you have, you know, these little metal works that then become paintings that then, you know, suddenly have a supposedly a different value. In this case, what looks like a sort of collection of landscape paintings are actually all angled mirrors. So it's a collection of paintings that you can't actually own because the paintings only exist in the mirror. The paintings are angled so that they're reflecting the interior painting of this little room. And from the outside, you just see these sort of glowing paintings, quote unquote. And then when you go in, the illusion is broken and you just see yourself. And it's a piece both about the sort of idea that you can't own something, that you know, about the sort of the impossibility of ever satisfying desire, which of course is a problem for all of us, but also this idea that as tourists, you know, we often destroy a beautiful place by going to it. So you go there and you want to have this thing, but then because there are all these tourists, it's been ruined. So that piece is very much also about that, and about this sort of privileged position that a person is in, who is, these are the interior walls. So you have this sort of beautiful kind of haute bourgeois painted interior, the fanciest kind of landscape, and then the mirrors are all hung over contemporary newspaper. So the kind of poorest kind of wall covering. And, you know, it talks a bit about this idea that, you know, appreciating either the world as in a picturesque way, where you see it as being, you know, you're like, does it make, you know, which is sort of Gilpin's idea, the British theorist in the 18th century, this idea of appreciating the landscape as if it were a painting, presupposes that you're the kind of person who's not dependent on the landscape. You can see it as a just aesthetic experience. Or the idea of appreciating something as sublime, which is that you're overcome with, you know, emotion, with terror, again, presupposes that you're not really threatened. Like a person who's running from an avalanche is not going to be thinking how sublime it is. But a person who is looking at the avalanche from far away might do. And this sort of idea of relating to the world in this way, and the way in which, you know, this sort of these art conventions, I think, imply a particular kind of viewer, is something that, you know, especially as ways of seeing the world have changed recently, where we can see the world from space, we can see the world on our phones. There's something that really has inspired a whole series of new works. I mean, some of them are ludicrous, like the next one with the mushrooms. This is just a landscape that I found in a junk shop. And it's an old tree mushroom. And I love this idea of saying, well, it's a landscape, it doesn't have very many clouds. So I could make some mushrooms into clouds. And then, of course, you bring it into the atomic age with the mushroom cloud.
Right, because also language is something that is very special in the works. We already heard about the wordplay also with Arcade, Arcadia before. And now mushroom cloud, of course, is also, in German, it would be Atompilz. So it's something that, sorry. Apologies.
That was my passport arriving. I'm so sorry. So yes, I mean, this question of bringing something, playing with words. I love titles. I mean, titles are always just very exciting. I think we're going to the next slide.
Yes.
So something like Mannheim is a place. This is based on a postcard made in the 1960s, which really, the idea that the Autobahn in Mannheim is such a perfect place is really completely fascinating to me. That that was worthy of being an actual image that people would send. So I made a painting of it with a little oval, which is a shout out to the sort of convention of the beautiful, picturesque landscape.
And and as we said, or you hinted on before, the picturesque as a term was invented only in the 18th century by William Gilpin, who was always pointing out that a picturesque landscape is not like the perfect Arcadia, but it has this certain kind of roughness or some aspect of things that really don't work. Bye, Doris. Sorry to see you leave. Which I think is very interesting also in your work when we go back and think of the Museum of Failure. So it's also, again, this kind of break in what we expect. I'm just hopping into the chat to see if there's a question. No, that was just somebody who unfortunately has to go. But it was really great to have you. And sorry. Also in terms of expectations, we always think of the perfect landscape, for example, in a sunset or in a moon, and we try to capture it with our devices, our now current devices like phones or our tablets. And I think this is something that you very beautifully talk about in this wonderful installation called On the Impossibility of Capturing a Sunset in Margate. And I really love saying this title aloud because I think it is so poetic, and we all fail in capturing the beauty of landscapes or something, not only landscapes, even just memories. We take these millions and thousands of photographs. I don't know how your phones are, but my phone has like 15,000 photographs, and in the end you hardly look at them because you actually fail in capturing all these moments, and the best images are the ones that you have in your head. So I very much like this installation, which is also connected to a disappointment in the tour of this exhibition, right?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that just this idea that we now have an access to making images in a way that's completely unprecedented. And so on the one hand, images are now so plentiful, it's fantastic. But on the other hand, they're also massively devalued. And you can also sort of be constantly dissatisfied. I mean, there's this sort of way in which this sort of consumer society in general, we're always like, well, I'll take another picture, but then you're not experiencing it. And of course, these are all hand engraved, just like Arcade, Arcadia, and they're sort of fake handies and fake phones and iPads. And they're all based on one photograph that I couldn't go to Margate because of COVID. So I had the curator stand on the beach and take a photograph of the sunset. And then I made all of these pieces based on that. It was very much a piece about kind of longing in that time when we're all trying to travel, but we can't. So it's also kind of a COVID shout out, as well as being one that's about, our relationship, or the way in which our experience of the world is now mediated through technology. And interestingly enough, how much of those aesthetics are still kind of dependent on landscape painting in a way, which I find fascinating.
Right, and it also combines how, again, images evolve. Like you have the engravings that with the possibility of printing have been, how do you say that, disposed in the world. So a lot of people had access to images suddenly, because it was a lot cheaper to buy etchings or engravings than, of course, commission a painter to paint a painting for them. And then with photographs, it happened in the same way. In the beginning, photographs were very expensive and precious, and now everyone can make photographs, and it's the digital age that really floods our phones and our minds with these images. So I think this is also a very interesting comment on how this history of making and observing and digesting images also changed.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting moment. I mean, I really do think we have this ability now to see the world in a way that would seem godlike to previous generations, and yet at the same time we're still so limited in what we do with that point of view. And in some ways, you want to go back. Our points of view are so fragmented, and yet you want this sort of enormous universal point of view. And yet, of course, universality is such a dream. Like nothing can be universal. It's always history is written by the winners, and so you always end up with people saying, well, everything is like this, but in fact that leads out so many stories. And that's something that I always find, I'm always torn between this dream of like a utopian future, and then the problem of like, well, what would that utopian future look like? Because often one person's utopia is somebody else's dystopia. I find that fascinating.
Absolutely. We just got one question from Julia Carlson in the chat. Have you considered an artwork on the NTF phenomenon?
On the
so the making an online digital image that just exists as a digital image in the web, and you can actually buy it online.
Oh yes. I'm sorry, I misheard you. No, I'm not interested in it. I actually feel that I'm a big fan of actually physically being in a place with an object. I don't like the ecological implications of them either, because they require a tremendous amount of energy. I'm not that interested in that. So I feel like to me it's not that interesting. But I mean, I think my main problem is that they're hugely bad for the environment. They require whole server farms to keep up, and we have enough of that. And also I like selling, I think people should be, I like the idea of making something that brings people physically together. I mean, obviously it's wonderful that I can be here from Brooklyn via Zoom, and a lot of my projects, have required the internet or have to work. But yeah, I love having people together. So it's not for me.
So I hope your question is answered, Julia. Thank you for it again. I'm moving on to the next slide now, because also I think since you have now pointed out the environment and your interest in the political social factors, there are also a lot of artworks that you are doing or making that really discuss how, or the type of footprint that humans leave on the world in types of climate change, for example, and destroying their own environment and landscapes. And we chose to start off with the Souvenirs of Armageddon, which is a series of, I think, 7 paintings, if I'm not mistaken, that look again like Polaroids.
Yeah, I mean, I like this idea of the Polaroid painting, because of course a Polaroid and a painting are so different. One is all about instant gratification and one of them takes ages to make. One of them is also seen as proof of something happening. And then of course a painting is not proof of anything. A painting is inevitably sort of a lie. I mean, all artists are unreliable narrators. In this case though, it's also about this idea from 2009. So this is an age ago. This was about some of the forest fires that were happening all the way back then. And this idea of the beauty and horror of this kind of climate destruction. So that, on the one hand, it's a souvenir and it's beautiful, but of course it's terrible. And to be able to say that it's beautiful means that you're in some way removed from it, that you're occupying again that privileged position of a person who's not actually affected by this phenomenon. And and this question of the point of view is one that also comes up with this project, which is just a little piece of TV rock, which is a kind of ulexite, which works a little bit like a fiber optic cable. So when you look at it directly, you can see through to the painting of the glacier behind. And when you look from the side, it disappears. Again, this is so the glacier is kind of melting in front of your eyes. It's just a tiny piece about a very big problem. And of course, this sort of the ultimate example of having this sort of point of view, this sort of new point of view is like, that thing of the human seeing the earth for the very first time. In this case, I was very much inspired by all of the protests that were happening in my life, and the fact that I got very tired of making protest signs all the time and having to do new ones all the time. So I thought I just needed some protest signs that would work in all situations. So the earth basically goes mainly to climate change protests, and the moon goes to everything else. And they're the same size because they're really twins. The moon has aspirations of grandeur. Here's the earth at the climate protest in 2019. And
it is really interesting how also, especially since the late 1960s, when humans conquered the space, it was really possible through satellite images to look back on the Earth and get a whole new view about our own planet. So it was the first time that we actually saw the planet from the sky, from kind of a probably godlike view also. And I think it's really interesting how you use this possibility of going back and forth. On the one hand, you have the details like this beautiful glacier, and the ulexite points out this very small detail of the surface of an iceberg or a glacier in this series of the small works. But then again, you go large scale. So you have this really interesting way of choosing different kinds of scales and effects of perspective, which I like very much about your work. And one of the largest scales, probably, if I'm not mistaken, is the Mermaid, or Atlantis in this case, that you were commissioned with by the Miami Beach Convention Center in Florida. And what we saw first, probably I'm going back again, so you can tell us about this project more in detail.
Well, this is a project where the Miami Beach Convention Center had a competition, and they commissioned several artists to make works. And I thought, well, the one story that's missing from this convention center is the real story, which is that all of it's going to be underwater quite soon, like the lost city of Atlantis. And so I made this piece that is made out of glass in this case. And it's mirrored glass, and it's engraved with a design that I painted by hand. That was the sort of start of the painting that's currently on view in the museum now. And when the light hits the glass, it looks like the whole thing is underwater. And then I kept on painting with my design to make it into an actual painting. And this is what's now being shown. It's 34 meters or 100 feet long. It's up at the museum, and it's called The Mermaid, Two Incompatible Systems Intimately Linked. On the one hand, you've got the sort of natural world, which I suppose is the tail of the mermaid, with Miami Beach being the head, the man-made world. So it's meant to and sort of exactly halfway through, you've got the two, you've got the sort of meeting of the two worlds. So it's the contrast between the man-made and the natural. But of course, if you think about it, nowadays, this natural world, this enormous nature preserve, is entirely dependent on the human world. And it's painted in a very, very labor-intensive way, because I wanted people to have that experience of being able to like physically walk up to it and zoom in, but also to have that sense that, you know, somebody spent, in my case, you know, over a year painting this. It's a huge problem, and the scale, I mean, as a person, I wanted people to feel dwarfed by the scale of the problem. So sort of symbolically, I wanted it to be something where you really get this sense of somebody trying to make sense of something that's just too difficult, just too complicated, and just too overwhelming to make sense of. You know, I think you could show an enormous photograph, but I don't think it would have the same emotional impact. At least I hope not.
I'm sure it doesn't, or it wouldn't. It's also interesting how I'm going back to this now, so you can see also the scale of a visitor in our museum to get a little bit more of a feeling how large this work actually is. So it's really a physical impact. You have to change your point of view. So it's not only mentally, but also physically, that you have to walk back and forth, take a distance to really observe the work. And I think this is a very good way of showing also how probably the world landscape was initiated as a landscape, being Landschaft in Dutch originally in the 17th century, land that was shaped by humans. And really here in the, whoops, where's my mirror? Here's the arrow. Here you can see where Miami Beach ends when you approach, and where the Everglades National Park starts, which is not influenced, or not influenced, yes, in the terms that, as you said, the water rises, but of course there are no roads inside or buildings or anything, so it's all really left natural. And it's also a question of what kind of landscape do we want to preserve, because it's actually a prairie that's underwater, and it has not been considered a beautiful or picturesque landscape before it became a national park. So these are also topics that you discuss quite often in your works. What does a landscape what makes this landscape sublime and picturesque?
Well, I think it's also that question of like, what of tourism, like what is it that's worth seeing? If you think about it, both the Everglades National Park and Miami are both big tourist destinations, but they're very different. And you're right, it's only in the 60s that that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas first sort of persuaded people that the Everglades were beautiful. Before that, it was just seen as an enormous swamp.
And as Pia just asked, it's not an engraving in this case. This is it's a painting.
It's a painting. It's painted in acrylic.
And this danger of Florida sometimes being or becoming a new Atlantis also leads me to another work that hints on what happens with the earth once it's been destroyed by us.
I know, I mean, such depressing things. Yeah, this
well, I wouldn't say depressing, it's just a lot of food for thought.
No, this is actually, you have to go back. We have to look at this, the hot dog stand for a second.
Okay.
So this is inspired by two things. One is this fantastic hot dog stand. Next slide. In Washington DC, which I saw it and I was like, that is how painting should be shown in the streets. And it's just roll around the streets, and but also by the fact that, you know, Washington DC is full of all these crazy buildings with lots and lots of columns and pillars everywhere. It's, you know, it's all neoclassical. And I had this really interesting conversation with someone about, actually with the curator Sarah Newman, about DC, and I said, it's amazing, you know, it's all the same architecture. And she said, well, you know, it's meant to symbolize democracy. And I thought, having grown up in the UK, like my first thought is actually the British Empire, and then I suppose it's the Roman Empire, and then maybe Greece. And then I started thinking about all these different worlds that have used for 2,000 years this one style of architecture. You know, a lot of them very problematically. I mean, Ruskin famously called it the architecture of slaves. But but it's, you know, so the Stalinists love it, the fascists love it, the Roman Catholic Church loved it. You see lots of banks that look like this. There are lots of, you know, slave plantations in the US that famously look like this. So it's not just democracy. So I thought, well, what if, you know, somebody else fell in love with this kind of architecture, and it became, and Washington, D.C. became a tourist attraction. And in the future, when we've messed up the world and there's nobody left alive, and the aliens come, and because they're my aliens, and so they're really nice aliens, their main core values of their civilization are swimming and flirting. And they're like, they see all these pillars and they're like, this perfectly represents our values. So it doesn't have to all be, you know, fascism. So in this case, the aliens start coming to Earth, which is now a lifeless desert, and they don't know very much about the lost pillar builders of Earth. And there's a brochure that accompanies the souvenir stand, which sets forth some of what the aliens think about it. And it's sort of based on all those sort of crazy moments, like you go somewhere, some archaeological site as a kid, and you start to realize, reading the text, they actually have no idea what happened there. So the aliens are just making stuff up. These are all various sites in DC, and they're pretty sure that the pillar builders, that we all lived in the ocean and swam upstream once a year to these big pillar building sites and built pillars together and probably had sex and reproduced and ate ritual postcards. And so they, you know, they pretty much get everything wrong. They think we were an egalitarian society because all the pillars are the same, and we were obviously telepathic because we keep on building the same thing. And this guide was also set forth in Washington, D.C., wherever there were guides to be had. And in the US, the term alien is also used to refer to people who are not US citizens. I was a resident alien for a while. And I had once read this very sad story about somebody finding a backpack in the desert with a little green card in it, like a real green card, with a little picture of a green alien in it. And I always wondered what had happened to that person who had this, who had tried to emigrate. And did they make it? Did they live? Did they die? So this sort of this idea of a souvenir stand for aliens has a double meaning again in the US.
And then I'm now skipping again to the next one.
Oh,
then there's also the Pillar Builder Archive, which is per se very impressive. So you collected all these pillars.
Yeah, there's about 5,000 postcards, all of places that are full of pillars, and then it's arranged like with like. So you end up with these really weird things where you're like, oh, like Gorky, where Lenin died, looks exactly like the White House, you know. And so it's arranged by aliens, so to speak. And this gets shown in different places, and again, is also arranged differently depending on where it is.
Which I think is interesting, that your aliens also obviously wanted to take on souvenirs, as we have souvenirs of places that we travel to. And at a certain point, there were postcards, for example. And here you can see the relations, by the way, between the postcards. And then you invented your own postcards as a wrong souvenir stand in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Oh, well, this is actually shown on the streets of St. Petersburg, Russia. So I made a souvenir stand for St. Petersburg, Florida, for the streets of St. Petersburg, Russia, and people. It was very popular, mainly because St. Petersburg, Florida is known as the Sunshine City, which if in St. Petersburg, Florida, Russia, everyone pointed out that they basically get the fewest amount of sunny days of any major city in the world. So they were taking all these postcards. You could take free postcards of the other St. Petersburg. It's also this idea that, you know, often people will invite an artist to make a site-specific project, and I was just trying to, and you know, the artist has no relationship to the site, so I thought it would be funny to imagine an artist who had just Googled St. Petersburg and got the wrong one. In this case.
But it also triggers a lot about how nostalgia works. So in a place where there is hardly any sun, or where you have a different kind of beach, or you always think of places that you love to travel to. So it's this idea of the souvenir also as a means of expressing your nostalgia for a certain space.
Well, yeah, I'm very interested in that question of desire. Like, what do you want to see? Like the piece on the right there, these are all, you know, these are all places that are, you would like to visit their palaces. in this case, and you can sort of see Trump and Putin and the people who actually inhabit the palaces. And the other side, you can see yourself in the mirrors, but you can't see yourself in these gold panels. It's called All That Glitter. So, and it's, yeah, with nostalgia, there really is this question of, is the past better? Like, is it gilded? These are two identical old frames, and one of them is covered with real gold. But the other one is the real, it is left the way it is. Which is better? You have to get to pick. And I think a lot of nostalgia, I think, you know, we often talk about nostalgia in our society right now, especially in certain circles, as being something that's toxic. And I think that's because nostalgia is often weaponized. It's used to, like, I don't know, emotionally manipulate people. But at the same time, I think that when you look at nostalgia more closely, you start to realize that in fact it's something that we've all experienced. And often nostalgia can be sometimes it can be very, like, a very small loss, but it all kind of comes out of kind of personal trauma. This is a piece where I gave away paintings to people who had lost things in Hurricane Katrina. So I put an advertisement in the Times-Picayune newspaper saying, have you lost something irreplaceable? And people sent in pictures or descriptions, and then I made paintings, and I printed their texts, and we exhibited the texts and the paintings I made, and then the people got to take them at the end. This is somebody who'd lost all their tools. And so it was really about this sort of symbolic action. I think the Museum of Failure is about feeling overwhelmed by not being able to do anything. But then this is a moment where at the same time I sort of decide, no, I'm going to just take some symbolic action. I can't really repair the world, but maybe I can symbolically repair it. So or I can destroy it. I mean, this is a piece where I got to actually ruin a church that nobody wanted in Belgium. This is what it looked like in 2009. Oops. And it replaced a church that had been destroyed in World War I. So is what it looked like then. And you know, so that we took everything off. We removed the roof. We removed all the interior columns. But at the same time, you know, and it's called repeat because it's this idea that people keep on building the same church and destroying it. They want it and they don't want it. But in the same time, you know, losing a church is a big scar for a community. So we did all this outreach to see what people wanted, and they wanted a communal space. So we made it into a kind of piazza for the village with a new terrazzo floor that shows all the things that were missing and the shadow of the previous church as well. And now, you know, it's really a container for the village. They use it for all kinds of things. And paradoxically, it's become a tourist attraction for them, which is this interesting idea that, like, you know, that ruins are somehow more artistic than functional buildings. Like the moment something becomes useless, it becomes a tourist attraction. It becomes an artwork. There's something about this idea of things that exist merely to be looked at or experienced. They're just about, you know, this sort of pleasure of being that seems to, you know, make something into an artwork in a way that's something that you can actually use as well, that it doesn't count. So again, it's sort of a callback also to that Barnes piece where the, you know, material metalwork objects, you hang them on the wall, do they become an artwork? Well, if you make them into a painting, then they're definitely an artwork.
And then this space in particular also became a social space, right? So it was open for people to use it, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it's intended that way. So people they have concerts, there are light shows, there's a dance, there's a disco. They use it for all kinds of things. So it's actually getting toilets now, which I think of as being the real mark of a successful public art project.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting about this piece in particular is that something is destroyed, but you really try to build it up again as it was. It's reconstructed, but it's not really the space anymore because people know it's reconstructed. And then you made it into something entirely new, but within a very sensitive way, reflecting the different stages, I think. And then you also offered people the possibility to reflect on the sites. And now, since we're going on to the Disappointed Tourist series now, you also asked people if there was a place that they always wanted to visit or revisit that no longer exists. So in many cases, people cannot go back to the places that they wanted to see. They just have these souvenirs or have the images and a nostalgia and memories in their heads. How did you start working on this project, The Disappointed Tourist, as a very huge ongoing project with more than 200 paintings by now?
I think we're at about, I'm actually at about 280 now. But no, this project really came out of, I mean, obviously a lot of projects that I've done had involved, nostalgia, questions of what people miss, what people want to see. But it came out of, for me, a desire to make an artwork where everyone would feel welcome. I felt that we were living, I mean, certainly in the States, we were living in a time that seemed very, very divisive. People seemed to be fighting a lot. Different people couldn't speak to each other. I felt there was a lot of, with Make America Great Again, so that slogan, there was a lot of ways in which people were weaponizing nostalgia in this way that I mentioned before. And I thought, no, it would be interesting to see if I could use nostalgia to create a project instead that would allow people to have empathy, to allow people to have conversations with other people, where people wouldn't feel judged, where everyone could be part of it. And I also thought it would be interesting to make a project where people could commission me, because of course, that's not something that most of the time people get to do. It's, it's very few people get to have the experience of commissioning an artwork. So I started by sending out postcards, then doing various other sort of events and, disseminating this question in different ways, and started to see what would come in. And eventually, I'm still working on it. So it'll be going on for another sort of 2 years. But I like this idea of having an enormous tourist attraction of things that you can't actually see because they don't exist anymore, but that people want to see. I'm interested in this idea of, using the love that people have for the world, for places, and so saying, that it's not terrible that we miss things. It's actually wonderful that we can do that. It's wonderful that we can care for the environment, that we can care for a beautiful piece of architecture. It's also this question of who do these things belong to? Often things get destroyed because they don't belong to someone, and people feel this sense of ownership and love, and yet they can't protect a place. So I sort of put it out into the world and thought, well, I'll see what comes back and see what kind of things we receive. And it was fascinating. I mean, it was a completely thrilling piece to make, especially during the pandemic, when, of course, you couldn't go anywhere anyway. So the title turned out to be quite prophetic. And it was also a piece where people could, I had all these conversations with people all around the world where they were sending me in their favorite childhood memories in many cases. That was one of the largest categories, of course, because we all are nostalgic for our childhood. So you had lots and lots of, amusement parks that people gone to, sometimes very sad ones where you look at it, you think that just looks awful, but somebody remembered it fondly. And some of them are ones that, disappeared before people were even born, or they heard about it from their grandparents in some cases. Some of them are quite old. And then a lot of places that were associated with kind of happy memories of childhood, like swimming. There were tons of places. This was a beach in Turkey that a lady had that's now filled in. It's all landfill. It's a parking lot. But she used to go there as a kid. And so this old lady had sent me this beautiful story about it. And sometimes some of these pools have other, places get re-shown. This is a pool that was built by Khrushchev on the site of the Church of the Savior. I believe it's the Church of the Savior, or Cathedral of the Savior in Moscow, which Stalin had torn down in the 30s. Then he didn't have enough steel because of the war to build the palace of the Soviets that he planned. So Khrushchev made it into the world's biggest open-air swimming pool. And then Putin has actually torn down the swimming pool and rebuilt the cathedral on this site. So this pool is now gone.
So this is also actually a project where everyone learns really a lot about the history of places. What is your usual process if somebody submits a site and you look into this? Obviously, the first thing is you check if this site has already been painted, of course, but what do you do in preparation before the works are painted? I'm just going to stroll through the paintings now because there are quite a lot of images.
There's so many, there's so many, these are all lovely swimming ones. When people send something in, at the beginning, I just painted everything that came in. But then later, now I'm at a point where I'm trying to paint as many as I can, but I'm about 100 behind. So people come to the top of the queue if it's from a place that I don't have anything from, or if it's a particularly interesting story. I mean, obviously the place has to have actually been destroyed, though sometimes it's quite hard to tell whether a thing has been destroyed or not. What if the ruin is still there? I've decided that ruins are okay. And then once I've, then I just keep going. I just get up every morning and keep painting. One of the things that was striking during the pandemic were how many of these places were social sites, like, bars and beloved restaurants and places that people like to mingle. So it really made me think about how much people love being together and having fun. Like sometimes people's just, ideas of fun are very strange, like playing tic-tac-toe with a chicken. But also this idea that technological change robs us of things like video stores, a thing of the past, or records.
Have there been some surprises in the process, or has there been a site that you can recall that you would never have imagined someone to submit as a missed site?
I think I was really, I knew that people would miss places that were sites of traumatic loss, but I was very interested in how many people, loss of, famous architectural buildings, or, but I was interested in how many people decided to take the project as an opportunity to elevate narratives that they felt were somehow missing. So, things where it's not so much that the beautiful place or the beautiful building is the thing that's missing, but it's sometimes, people, you can tell that people wish that we lived in a world where something hadn't happened, or something hadn't been destroyed, or where they think, oh, I wish people knew more about the history of this place and what had happened here. So I thought that was really interesting. And also the way in which some things, like that one person thinks are beautiful, but like this kind of graffiti side, somebody else might be like, oh, I'm so glad they tore it down. Or some cases, places like Penn Station here, were the impetus for creating the Landmark Commission in New York. But I think the person, for example, the next slide, who sent in the Bonwit Teller building, probably sent it in because it's the site of the Trump Tower. And I'm not sure whether they were that attached to the Bonwit Teller building. So sometimes it's really about kind of people wishing for an alternative reality, I think, which I think is also part of the sort of interest of it is I didn't know that much about, what happened in Benin. And it puts things into perspective. A lot of sort of tragic sort of destructions today of places that are incredibly beautiful and significant. You have to be seen as part of a backdrop of centuries of us destroying things. It's not just ISIS and Al Qaeda that are destroying stuff, but or the Taliban, but also this is the Sarajevan War. I've got a lot of this is was destroyed during the Arab Spring. I have a lot of synagogues, obviously, that were destroyed during Kristallnacht or the war, Hiroshima. So people sent in. It really gives you a perspective that people both love places and are upset that they're destroyed. And sometimes these places, like the Temple of Jerusalem, have this incredible, so to speak, hangover. Like the destruction of this temple is still affecting us all today, if you think about it. So I found that really fascinating. And when you see all of these different stories together, you can really, this is sent in by a child. Children love sending in super old things that they learned about in school that they wish they could see. But when you see all these stories together, you really get a sense of how varied people's losses are, and that people won't necessarily agree about all of these losses. That and that I think is what makes the piece interesting. There are also a lot of ecological losses. Sometimes this is the earthquake, but this is a glacier that melted due to climate change. So a lot of people are also calling out, this is all burnt down in one of the great fires. This obviously is one of the olive groves uprooted in Palestine by the Israeli army. A child who wanted to the reef. These are all places that, for one person, one of them will be important. Some of them will perhaps not be important at all. Like the next one, the Steirische Weinstuben, is like a beloved place in Salzburg that I'd never heard of. I don't think, if the ship, when the project travels next to Poland, probably won't, that will be a mysterious site for people. And that's why I wrote the website. So the website, you can look up and you can find out about, why somebody would submit this tree in Salzburg, or these are both the sites of where the museum actually is today, the Café Winkler. I love the fact that if you look for Café Winkler on TripAdvisor, you can still find it, even though it's not been there for obviously ages and has been replaced by the Museum der Moderne. But people are still looking about it because they heard about it as this beautiful place. And I think that's what I liked, and that's what I loved about sitting in the show, was watching people standing in front of this piece, discussing all these sites, discussing which places they missed, and sometimes looking up a site, learning somebody else's stories, because all of the pieces, most people who send them in with a personal story about why that site is important. And that, to me, is one of the great pleasures of the piece, is this idea that you can learn, you can learn from somebody else's losses. It's to be human is to have experienced loss in some form or another. And yet I think that if you see it all together, you both feel comforted in some ways, because I'm obviously symbolically repairing all these losses, but at the same time, hopefully it makes people also think about all the things we should preserve and all the new beautiful things we should build, and how we can maybe use this sort of love for place to take better care of our world.
And what I like about it also is that all the paintings are the same size. You don't judge that someone's loss or someone's nostalgia for a place is more important than someone else's. The loss of, for example, the Temple of Bel has the same size as the Elektrische Aufzug, for example, who some people might not miss at all because they didn't even know they existed. And it doesn't have this kind of really huge cultural impact that, of course, an antique site had. And that's what I really like a lot about this work in particular. Since it's already 19 or half past 7, I would like to go on to the last set of images and the last questions, and using this wonderful opportunity to look at the old Café Winkler and the Elektrische Aufzug, to also talk about your connection to Salzburg and what impact also your teaching at the Summer Academy a few years ago had on your work when you met, can I say met? Yeah, probably, with the Zafala Panorama and the Cosmoramas of Hubert Sattler, and a wonderful work that was specifically made for our exhibition about the panorama. You already had a sort of panorama when we looked into Arcadia, which was the panorama of Margate, of the coastal line. So what was your specific interest in the work of the Sattlers, both father and son?
Well, I've always been fascinated, to be honest, by panoramas. So when I found out that I was teaching in Salzburg, where I'd never been, which is, I was excited because it's famously beautiful, of course. And it was very exciting to teach up in the castle. I had a wonderful time. But I was very excited to learn there was a panorama, because I love this. I love these sort of pre-photographic technologies like the Claude glass, like Claude mirrors and panoramas. This idea of, somebody who's trying to recreate the world obviously speaks to the sort of maniac in me. And so the Zafala Panorama, which I went to see, is literally my favorite panorama in the whole world. This is me in it, looking very Caspar David Friedrich, I think. And because it took him 5 years of painting this, and then he traveled it around the world for 10 years as kind of advertisement for the town of Salzburg. So it's this perfect sort of conflation of, art, painting, and tourism. This idea of painting as a kind of technology of representation, which of course now we don't use the same way. And then his son made all these paintings of different famous tourist sites called the Cosmoramas, which I saw. He made there are several hundred of them, I believe. I sort of recently saw them all in storage. They're incredible. And I thought, and they were also sort of an inspiration for the disappointed tourist. I mean, the look of it is sort of based a bit on the Cosmoramas and a bit on sort of these old hand-fashioned, hand-colored postcards. But I really, so I was so excited to get to show the disappointed tourist in Salzburg, because I thought it's really the perfect place for it. But then I really wanted to do a shout out to the panorama, which I love. And so I thought what would a panorama today look like? And I thought, oh, you would just stand in the same place and you would just take a sort of selfie image of yourself turning in a circle. So Tina very gamely, this is a collaboration piece really between us, Tina very gamely climbed to the top of the tower where Zafala stood and turned in a circle. And then I made a series of 36 paintings, one for every 10 degrees, of the view with a little selfie ghost in the middle. And you can sort of see the selfie ghost in the middle. And then when you put it all together, you get to have a little panorama experience. So it exists both as a series of paintings and as this gift with a little ghost in the middle.
And it's great because as well as the Zafala Panorama, this is also freezing a certain moment in history. And of course, the city of Salzburg, the city center, is a UNESCO site. So it's you cannot really change anything in the center. But of course, the city evolves, and it's very interesting to compare how the structure of the city has changed when you look at the panorama at the Panorama Museum of the Salzburg Museum. And I really cordially invite you to take advantage that you can see it until September, and then it might be gone for a certain while because there's going to be a new site for the panorama. And then come back to the exhibition here and look at the paintings, because you see how the city changed, how, for example, the Salzach looks very differently now that it's been regulated in the late 19th century and somehow disappears behind. I'm just trying to look. No, that's the wrong side, but still, it kind of disappears behind the high buildings. And in your panorama, you can actually see the fortress, which was forbidden for Johann Michael Sattler to paint it, because at that time it was also a point of military importance. So it would have been illegal for him to paint it. So it's really a nice way to freeze a moment in time, which I think is very interesting, and also leads a little bit back to the Unloved again, because those are also series of moments of how a city develops.
Yeah. It's a love letter to Salzburg, it has to be said, which I think it well deserves. It's been a really extraordinary experience, and I have to say that, it's been wonderful to work with you, Tina, and everyone at the museum. It's really been a wonderful collaboration and a great pleasure for me.
So, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much, Ellen. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I see that there are no more questions in the chat, but of course now you have also there. What are you working on right now, and what's coming up next? Thank you. That's a very good question.
Well, I'm still working on the Disappointed Tourist. So if you have some ideas, you can just go to www.disappointedtourist.org. You can just Google Disappointed Tourist or my name and you'll find it, and send it in. But so I'm still working on that for the next couple of years. And part of the show that's up at the Museum der Moderne is going next to the Wajnia Center for Contemporary Art in Gdansk. And that's really what's happening with me right now. So mainly I've still got at least another year of Disappointed Tourists.
Is there a specific work that you're currently preparing that you can already tell us a little bit about?
I'm currently painting I just started a painting of a piece that's called Ghost Parking Lot, which is by an artist. Oh no, my tiny brain has forgotten his name. He went under Site, S-I-T-E. I have to look up. If you look up Site and Ghost Parking Lot, you will find his name. Someone just sent it in, so I haven't done all the research yet. But it was this sort of parking lot where he covered all the cars in asphalt, which was demolished. So the ghost has been killed. So I'm painting that right now.
Thank you very much. As you can see, of course, there would be a lot of other questions. And I just realized before that we didn't talk about the different kinds of mirrors that you're using and so many other things.
You and I could talk for a long time.
We can talk.
Everyone will fall asleep.
And I know that Ellen is also a very generous person. So I'm sure if you have more questions, she will be happy to answer them, for example, by email, if I may say that.
It's true. I am by design easy to reach.
And I'm really inviting you to take the advantage of the last days of the exhibition. It's only up until Sunday, February 20th. So if you have a chance, please do come. It would be really lovely having you. And there might be a slight chance that you can also meet Ellen in the exhibition on the weekend, because we're all in love with this exhibition so much that we spend so much time in it. Thank you very much, really, for your attention, for your interest in our conversation. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I hope that you're going to come back to the museum, and also our next shows that are going to be installed and presented within the next weeks. Have a very nice evening. Oh, thank you, Victoria, for pointing out the 3D tour that we have made. So this is something that, of course, was